Zero apologies.
Droppin Truths.
This is Kyle Cronk.
And I'm Dr. Sarah Lloyd.
We are here to bring you compelling topics on social justice and anti-racism work in our local community with YMCA leaders.
We're so excited you're joining us. We hope you learn together and you get to grapple with the truths we drop.
So it's time to do the work. Buckle up. Zero apologies.
Droppin Truths.
We are back.
Yeah.
Looking good. The hair's coming in.
Right?
I like the outfit, like the
Thanks.
shirt, the shoes, the whole ensemble.
It's a whole thing.
Are you feeling good?
I'm feeling great.
Awesome.
How are you feeling good?
I feel way better than I did the last time we shot, which people here won't know that was just yesterday. So I feel a lot better. I feel good.
Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. We're here, Zero Apologies, Droppin Truths, to show and kind of teach and learn about being more anti-racist and specifically about racial equity.
Absolutely. And model what it looks like to be in community and in relationship with people who are doing the work.
And learning as we go along and dealing with sometimes uncomfortable, just the uncomfortableness of talking about these topics. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there's uncomfortable moments, but people work through them. People still stay in relationship. They still care for one another. They still move forward through the work, even though it is hard and sometimes it's shocking isn't really the right word, but
how about unsettling?
Well, that and not like realizing something for the first time, or when it's pointed out to you. That sometimes is like not, because sometimes when it's pointed out to you, you've actually done harm. Right. We talked about violence and being in a violent thing and microaggressions. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about microaggressions, talk about how that shows up probably in the workplace, but maybe it's outside the workplace as well, just as frequently. Especially when black and white people get into relationship and communities, because there is, and then the other thing that you talked about was the unconscious bias is not really unconscious anymore. I showed Miguel a stat that came across my Facebook feed in California. They were showing the percent of population who was vaccinated, and then they did it by race. And you're not going to be shocked to know that more white people are getting vaccinated way faster than black and brown people.
That's so weird.
Yeah. So my question is, back to your comment on the unconscious bias. Like today in 2021, knowing that, why, how can that happen? How isn't somebody that's in charge making that not a reality?
I think if you were to sum it up simply, it would be like, what are the consequences? I had this great conversation with someone I really treasure and respect a lot in this work, who also is a white male. And we were talking about how even when he was at stages of his life where he was steeped in the work, he still didn't really have a real realization of the scale. So the presence and the scale are two different things, right? And so he went into this environment and talked to brown and black individuals and were like, what percent of people do you think are racist in the nation? And then he did the same thing in that same environment with the white folks. And what he found was that he, in his mind, had already decided, like, it's probably about like 30%, okay? Then he goes and asks the white people, and they're right around there, 27 to 35. But the black and brown people were like 85% and higher. And he had this real moment where he was like, oh. So it's like, it's not like he was oblivious and then started doing the work. He was doing the work and being like, oh, it's so much deeper. It's so much broader. It's more intrinsic, right? And so I think it's that. It's like, there's a piece of doing the work as a white person where there's this inherent assumption that you will lose or sacrifice in order to move forward. And so I think every single individual inside of the system is making decisions at all times about like, what are they willing to sacrifice? Right. And I think the perception of sacrifice is greater if you're white and benefiting from the system.
Mm-hmm. We touched on that a little bit yesterday. I think that is some of the things that prevent maybe more white people getting into the work or diving in at a deeper level, is that potential fear around what they will lose.
And I think I've never met every white person, and you guys get the luxury
Really?
of being. I haven't, not yet. I have like 8 more to go, but like you guys have the luxury of being individuals instead of like a representation of white people. But what I have noticed both in research and anecdotally is that most white people, if not all white people, have that same fear. It just is like, at what point in the work is there a fear? So is it inherently like, I'm not going to say anything because I'm going to mess up? Or is it like, I'll go to a certain point, but once I'm about to lose my job and lose a resource and can't provide for my family, that's my threshold? But there is that fear. It's just a matter of like when it sinks in. And I think the recognition of understanding that is because you understand fundamentally what the penalty is for Blackness and the association of Blackness, right, because you're watching Blackness navigate through the world. And so when you understand fundamentally, like there's this pause that you have, you're like, I'm not trying to do that, because you know what happens. It's not hypothetical. You know what happens because in your case, you watch me and all of the other people you associate with hit against the walls of what it looks like to fly in the face of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. A slight pivot, but not a big pivot off of that. I have a question about community, and communities in particular with a racial equity lens. So there's this phrase that has been like going through certainly YMCA work, and so it's obviously it crosses my path. And people have stopped short of defining this, and I want to talk about it with you. So the phrase is something like, you know, young people through the Y are the leaders and change makers that are going to create the communities that we want to live in. And when I hear those words, communities that we want to live in, let's focus for a minute to center Black and brown people in communities that we want to live in. I want to know what you think communities that we want to live in look like. What are some characteristics? And if this is putting you on the spot, I can give you some time to ruminate on that. But when we think about, because the why I'm asking this particular question is we had a different episode where we were talking about centering Black voices. And that's really important in the work that I'm trying to do within our organization. Mm-hmm. When I think about opening a Y in Shelton community, how do we focus on non-white people? So giving you a little time to center that for you. So, and there's no right or wrong answer here. This is more dialogue back and forth. Like I'm interested in defining the phrase communities we want to live in.
Mm-hmm. So there are so many thoughts that I have. Number one, it's precious that you're like, I'll give you some time to think about it. Like I'm not always ready for all the things.
I know.
So thank you for
you're
that.
Already
Number
posted
two,
up.
I like when you give disclaimers that don't apply to me inherently. Like for instance, you're like, I know there's like, you don't have to come up with the right answer. And I'm like, that's so fascinating because those are the moments where I'm like, is that what it's like to be white? Like you have to like know the right answer because I know inherently that what I'm saying is not necessarily the right answer. It's a little T-truth. And so it's just fascinating. It's one of those moments. So everyone could enjoy what was happening in my head. So in terms of communities we want to live in, I think foundationally, first, you have to understand that Blackness is not a monolith. And so even if, for instance, myself, I'm like the smartest person ever, and I've done a ton of academic research, and I have lived experience, and I have practical application. So all of those things deepen the understanding and awareness that I have of how it works. And also, I still can't hold the universal truth, but I can say what I know based on my experience and then also what I know to be true throughout all of those realms of knowledge. And inside of that, I think first and foremost, it has to actually center Blackness. And the ability to say that without like pausing, the ability to not be like BIPOC, but centering Blackness, like how do we get to a point where like people are just comfortable with the idea of that itself? I think it's foundational because if otherwise I can give you a plan of what it should look like. And most likely, again, based on the access I have to information, it'll be pretty good. And we still will have individuals in the organization or in the community or in the spaces who are not even willing to say Blackness. Like throughout our culture, we have this propensity to say people of color when we actually mean black, because blackness is that offensive. So how do we design a community that centers and prioritizes specifically blackness with a preference for black women without people even like about it, right? So I think first and foremost, it's the willingness to say, what does that look like? And then I think the mechanics of centering blackness, there's a difference, and you and I have had a conversation before about this. Like, there's a difference between centering me as a person, centering blackness, centering my voice, centering my experience. Like, all of those things are different. And so the mechanics of what it looks like is to say, if we designed this for blackness as we currently understanding it, allowing it to shift and change, because if we dismantle a structure, then the meaning of blackness also will change, right? Ooh. And so looking at that, like, how do we prioritize blackness in the same way that without even thinking about it, we do with whiteness now? And that will shift and change and inform everything that we do in that community.
Thank you. And a lot to think about there, a lot of different section points there. So when people say the phrase communities we want to live in, and if you go down the path of centering blackness, mm-hmm. is that a worthy thing to engage in? Is that the right question?
Well,
or maybe not even the right question, but the right phraseology.
I think it depends on who's driving it. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. So here in Thurston County, a few years ago, and by a few, it was probably like 5 by now, there was a group of people who were working on like poverty reduction measures. Okay. We were in this meeting and someone was like, so we're going to do like focus groups. We're going to talk to people. We're going to find out what their experience is like in poverty. And then once we find that out, we'll build a plan for getting them out of poverty. Right. And I was like, okay, I just have one question though. And they were like, right. And I was like, what if they don't want out of poverty? And they were like, how could that be a thing? And I'm like, if you're really going to do a focus group, then you can't be tied to the outcome. And what you might find inside of people in poverty is that their biggest issue is not poverty. They might be blissfully happy. In fact, some studies have shown that people in poverty are actually happier than people with resource, because resource is not tied to happiness. So are we going in knowing what's going to come out of it? Or are we going in really curious about what people experiencing poverty are currently going through? And that can be tied to this as well. So I think if white leaders throughout the YMCA are like, oh my gosh, you know what we need? A community in which we all want to live here. First of all, I'm like, who's your we? And second of all, maybe inherently there are so many things that need to be done before I want to be in community with you. So if you're pushing this agenda to be like, let's build a community in which Sarah wants to live here, and I'm like, I don't want to live in the Pacific Northwest, for one. Number two, I don't really like you. Number three, all this damage has been done. Then there are so many things to do before you get to a point where you're building a community in which I want to live, right? So the real question is, who is we? And do I actually even fit into that? And how do we build a we where then we can talk about our priorities? Because communities we want to live in doesn't feel like I'm even driving that as the place to start.
All good stuff, and more questions that I've got around that. So the we based on how I think that people were using it, is an all-inclusive we, mm-hmm. and creating a non-racist community, or at least a more racially equitable community. Mm-hmm. So that would be the we, and it wasn't specific to the Pacific Northwest. I think the idea behind that phrase was somewhere in the United States. So pick your spot, mm-hmm. and then within the white supremacist structures that are in all of the spots in the United States, how do we get to change that? Right. I think the idea was around the concept that young people are coming up as leaders with questions and concerns about social justice, racial equity as the driving force. And the theory with some leaders, black and white, in the Y movement were saying that they felt a hopefulness that Y leaders, young Y people coming up in the organization, are asking about social justice issues. So I think it was from that frame of mind or point of view.
Sure. All I'm saying is there's an assumption in whiteness that you'll be included in the end result, which is fascinating because inherently there may be 8 steps before we get to designing a community, including one where I'm like, I can safely exist in space with you in community and not worry about when I will be harmed. And that feels like more important and foundational to designing a community, right? So it's like if you literally have harmed me 1,000,000 times and then you're like, I have a great idea, Sarah, what we're gonna do, because I need a new house and so do you, so we're gonna build like a joint house for the Cronk Lloyd experience, right? And I'm like, first of all, I don't want to live there. Like, you harm me every day, right? So I think it's a beautiful idea, and sometimes this is what happens. I think we often collectively either struggle with the foundational points in getting moving, or we want to jump to like, oh my gosh, what will utopia look like? And it's like, sure, but when I say to you, like, where are you centering blackness right now, you get visibly uncomfortable. So like that needs to be resolved before we can like design a community in which like we're like this, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I specifically want to figure out how we center blackness in these conversations and define the we. That's why I was asking the question is, like, are we starting at the right point? It sounds more, from your perspective, it sounds more generative. We need to start back at the beginning. Like, do we even want to be in community together?
Right.
And who is the we coming together?
Or what does it take for blackness to want to exist in community with whiteness before we start getting out the whiteboard and designing the blueprints, right?
Where does, in your view, where does this comfort, whatever you want to call it, centering of blackness, getting that concept, the idea together? Because that, well, for me personally, that does not drive any discomfort. Centering, I think that there's some questions that I've got about how do I proactively better center blackness in experiences, whether that's work, outside of work, how, you know what I'm asking?
Totally.
Okay.
And I think so you're a great example. If I can put all your business on blast, that would be great. So number one, all your business. So number one, I think you embrace fully the concept of centering blackness. I think when you start talking about the mechanics of what it means to truly center blackness constantly, there are times when I'm like, so this, and you're like, wait, what? And I'm like, And so I think that's where discomfort comes. And so I think some people are uncomfortable with like blackness in general. Some people can't even say black. They're like African American. And then there are some people who are like, I'm totally in. And I'm like, cool. What it means is you need to do this. And they're like, I mean, is that the only way though? And I'm like, yes. And actually, like, we're at 101 right now, right?
Yeah,
so
right. We're back. We got out of 98.
98, yeah, for sure. Because the desire to want to do it, like, emphatically is amazing. So I think it's like, are you comfortable? Are you comfortable with the concept? Fantastic. Move on to the next step of what does that mean? And if you don't know what it means, then you can't say that you're not uncomfortable with it, because inherently both, number one, it's going to be uncomfortable, and then two, you're going to have to understand fully what it's going to take. But like biologically, it will cause discomfort to change something. Like that's how your brain works, right?
Totally.
And so to assume that in a space where you are creating radical change that you won't be uncomfortable is inherently, like, already we're set up for failure. So understanding, like, if we need to create a roadmap for what it means to center blackness, there are going to be some things like, you're like, is this a menu or like a prescription? Because I want to choose some things and I don't want to do some other things.
Oh, I like that. And I mean, it's more of a prescription. I mean, that's the
It's absolutely a comprehensive checklist prescription.
Gotta do it. Mm-hmm. Can't step on to step 2 without going step 1. I like that. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So that wasn't even my question that I was going to ask.
Great.
And you were so good.
Per the usual.
As we talk about, so a similar topic though, when you think of racial equity in a community, mm-hmm. do you think, like, can you expand on that a little bit? Like, what comes to your mind when you think about what does it look like or feel like in a racially equitable space?
Okay. So let's use organizations as a microcosm because it's a lot simpler than trying to think about neighborhoods. Okay.
Right.
So in an organization that centers Blackness, first of all, there will be Black people present, and not in a tokenizing way, but because they add value in addition to their Blackness.
Yeah.
Then when you're in a space as like a leader of an organization, let's say the team that is meeting in any one given moment doesn't have proximity to Black pain in the current structure. What it would look like is being like, we are not qualified or aware enough to make a decision right now until we check in with people who have expertise and lived experience in this context. So it would consistently look like being like, yeah, I don't know. Just like if you just built a whole big ass facility in Shelton. And there are moments where they're like, Kyle, you're in charge. And you're like, I don't do construction though, right? They're not just going to be like, power through it. What would a construction person say? You instead would be like, let's get a fucking expert in here.
Right, yeah.
And so it's the same thing. It's like, if we're going to build and construct those things inside of a system where Black people don't have authority or power, then we have to intentionally tap into the need that exists, but not being like, Sarah, what do Black people want? Instead being like, what does it look like and what are the priority points?
I love that. There's some intersections of things that I'm a part of at the moment where we're talking, I'm in conversations where there are not Black people present talking about racial equity things. And obviously that's problematic. We have to change that because we've got white people sitting around or zooming around, whatever it is that we're doing in 2021, that are coming up, or they think they're coming up with these
brilliant solutions.
So,
and they're just unvetted, and so
right.
I think the tokenizing element of it that is harmful is both assuming that like any Black person you talk to has done the work around their own Blackness, because if we're all raised in a white supremacist society, then we're all programmed to center whiteness and to protect the discomfort. So one, you're assuming like a level of expertise that they may not have. Two, there is a whole development process that happens around racial identity, and they might be at stage 1, which is like a devout denial of the fact that they are different than dominant culture, in addition to the fact that they might be like, well, this is my experience, so this is what I want. And I'm like, I don't even want that. And so then they're like, oh, so they might participate in the monolithing of an entire race. So you have to be able to tap into individuals who are well rooted in understanding what it means, like what Blackness in the current structure means, and where are we headed, and are they aligned values wise with actual collective liberation, or is it more about like, I'm just trying to get a paycheck? Like, so all of those things have to be vetted. And once you get into a space where someone has either lived experience and expertise, or expertise and proximity to pain, then you can have that conversation. Because there are some white people who are equipped with enough knowledge and proximity to pain to lead that discussion, at least at some point. And so that's why tokenizing is so dangerous, because you don't know if you're furthering harm or not.
Yeah, right. Because
and it might be harmful to participate, right? And I might not be ready for that.
Right.
Or y'all might not be ready for that.
Yep. Awesome. I didn't comment on the earrings. I love them.
Africa.
Totally. Anything?
Shout out to the motherland.
Yes. Anything that you want to say more on that, or anything that you want to ask me about this topic, or as it relates to the why? I mean, thinking about your role as a leader, as a board leader in an organization that views itself or is trying to view itself as multicultural, multi-generational, and trying to center on a national scale racial equity as its thing. Because I think that I think it's as an organization, it's trying to lead in space that is, obviously very challenging to lead in.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think there's, I work with an organization now through Soul on Fire. We're part of their Black-owned business.
True.
Part of their mission, it details this part that I love. It's they're working with organizations to implement anti-racist diligence, and I love it. I'm obsessed with it. And so I think part of it is, shout out to Ampersand, but part of it is what are the mechanics, not the solutions. So I think whiteness is geared towards okay, but what is it where are we going? What's the
That's what I've been driving at. You got it. Good one.
But it's actually what are the mechanics of doing that well, and how do we with integrity do that?
That's exactly it.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it looks like, for instance, I go into spaces regularly, and I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm just saying, normally I'm the smartest person in the room, and I'm used to that. It's been my experience, right? People are quick to be you're smart. Other value add, questionable, but you're for sure smart, okay? So when I'm in spaces and I'm
they don't go to humor? Because
I
would have gone
some people
right there.
Even Breslin's
your own
really
child.
My own child. I'm one day you'll see it. But so if I am in a space and I'm with authority saying, hey, I know about this thing, and here are the solutions, and here's step one, and this is how we can move forward, and people can look at me and be what do you think, Kyle? Right? It's what?
No!
What?
No!
And I love you dearly, but come on. So there's some real moments of and if you have to question everything in order to move forward in dismantling white supremacy, then I think you also have to discuss everything.
Yeah.
And being okay, so time out. Here are the logistics of what just happened. Let's talk about how Sarah just dropped bombs and no one's acknowledging that. Let's talk about how she just let us know there was harm done and no one's acknowledging that. Mm-hmm. Why is that happening and not allowing that to be my burden? I think that's checkpoint number one, is saying are we examining everything? And then it does no good for me to be I'm noticing that our organization's a shit show, right? It does good when I say I'm noticing some things and we have to do something about it. And so I think that's how white people can start to center Blackness, is both notice and then address where we're falling short as organizations. Because otherwise it's we will sit here in this room and talk ad nauseum about centering Blackness while doing harm in the same conversation. But when I'm the accountability measure for that, it's again that point of dilution, right? It's I'm here's the 92 ways in the last 10 minutes you guys have done harmful ass shit, and it's 92. That's not that bad because it's the average, not the sum.
Right. So the mechanics again, noticing, addressing. I mean, those are two of the mechanics. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming there's a laundry list of
for sure
mechanical things that go into centering Blackness, and I like the way that you talked about, and this has been one of the things that we've talked about before, that white supremacy culture is looking for solution. Kind of even back to this thing that we're talking about with you about some writing that you're about to do. Even that is steeped in that.
Right, because it's what's your plan and where are we going?
Right, and it's probably not as informed as it could be from people that are proximity to the thing that's being changed. No. I don't want to name the thing because I don't want to mess up something.
But
isn't that crazy?
Not really. Because, I mean, it's exactly the same thing as the conversation about, like, what does a community look like, right? Because I'm like, I don't know what a community looks like because we need to talk to people. So if I really go into situations with curiosity and I'm like, Kyle, why did you say that? Like, what were you thinking? What did you notice? Then the outcome of that could be anything. But if I'm like, hey, Kyle, did you know that this is happening? And you're like, no, then the whole entire plan is ruined. And so it really is about, how do I go into situations with real curiosity and a real willingness to examine everything, understanding I might actually be the problem in every single scenario, and I'm still willing to push forward because collective liberation is way more important than my discomfort.
Sure.
So I'm willing to ask the questions and see what happens after that.
Yep. Excellent. And
if you're doing that genuinely, then you cannot have solutions because inherently you're not making space for the response.
I think we're sort of running out of time. I want two different things. Is there a difference in your opinion on solutions versus vision?
I think a vision is a manifestation of the solutions you have in mind.
Got it. Another white construct.
Absolutely. I mean, as we currently apply it, yes.
Are you interested in highlighting a black-owned business?
I am, but I actually want you to tell us about your favorite shoreline black-owned business.
Black Coffee Northwest.
Yes!
I clapped, so maybe you didn't hear. Black Coffee Northwest up in Shoreline, they're doing amazing things. So not only do they do amazing coffee and normal coffee shop related stuff like pastries and food and all that stuff, but they do a tremendous amount of youth development work. They're doing, I think Darnisha is the owner of it with her husband, and they do a step thing. I mean, it's unbelievable the amount of cool stuff that they're doing, and it's great. So shout out to them.
Yeah, they're doing awesome. It for the culture.
They're awesome. Oh, for Absolutely. Sure. And they've got, Darnisha's got just a sweet social media game.
Nice. Yeah. Very good. And speaking of sweet social media game, Cabin Light Studios.
Oh, aren't they the best? We're in their place. They
are the best.
And they got this going on. I was waiting for you to jump up and do a little.
You keep saying that.
Beat while you're schooling us.
It's not happening.
All right, fair enough.
Though all great music is rooted in Blackness. We can talk about that another day.
Ooh,
but Cabin Light Studios.
That's another truth dropped.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Cabin Light Studios, Brown owned, Brown operated.
Miguel's
They're
doing
so
some funky
dope.
dancing over there.
Can you focus, please?
It's hard. He's in my...
Brown owned, Brown operated.
Yeah.
We're all about that brown generational wealth.
Yeah.
So we appreciate them. Without them, we would still be doing it on your iPhone 7.
Yeah. Oh, that is old school.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So thank you, Cabin Light.
Yes. And I think that's it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, it was good to be back. 2021 is going to be good.
Yep. Let's get it.
All right. Peace.
Bye.
Bye. This was Zero Apologies.
Droppin Truths.
White folks, share this with your friends and make sure you're doing the work.
And black folks, welcome home.